Okay, on last time we were together, we were talking about the early Renaissance, roughly the 1400s. Today we're moving to the high Renaissance, roughly the 1500s. When we move from the early Renaissance to the high Renaissance, we move in two ways. First of all, we move in time. The early Renaissance is roughly the 1400s, the high Renaissance roughly the 1500s. And then we also move in place. The big center of activity for the early Renaissance, stuff we looked at last time we were together, was the city of Florence in Italy. The big center of activity for the high Renaissance is the city of Rome in Italy. The big focus of activity shifts to Rome. That's because somebody else becomes a major player in the patronage system, and that is the Pope. The last time we talked about Rome was all the way back in the Carolingian Renaissance, the year 800. I told you that Rome had been pretty much abandoned during the barbarian invasions, that a few people had moved back into town, including the Pope, who makes Rome his headquarters. The headquarters of the Pope called the Vatican. That word's going to come up a couple of times in the lecture today. He's going to spend a lot of money making Rome a beautiful place. No, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead of myself. I've got a lot of things going on in my mind, and all good things, it's just a lot. When I last talked about Rome in about the year 800, I mentioned that it was just a burned out husk of a town, hardly anybody lived there. A few hundred years later, in the 1500s, it's still a burned out husk of a town. It just has a lot more wear and tear on it. And it's pretty much a rundown, junky place to live. And one pope in particular is going to come along, a pope named Julius II. You don't need to worry about getting his name down, but he's going to spend an awful lot of money making Rome a beautiful place. He's going to enter the patronage system. He's going to hire a lot of clients, civil engineers and architects and sculptors and all kinds of people and make Rome a beautiful place, just spending an awful lot of money doing so. And really, I think that's all the background you need to know to make sense of the stuff we're going to be looking at that comes out of the High Renaissance. And so if you have your textbooks with you today, I'd like you to go to page 67 in your textbooks. Figure 11.1 on page 67. The artist here, Raphael, and the painting, The School of Athens. When you get to page 67 in your textbook, figure 11.1, or when you see the image on your screen here, I hope that it looks vaguely familiar to you. We looked at it once before when we talked about the Athenian philosophical tradition. You remember the two central figures there, Plato and Aristotle. Plato pointing up towards that divine, sacred, perfect world of the theos thing. Aristotle kind of bringing him back down to this physical universe that you and I live in. I told you that we'd catch up to the painting in the course, and here we have. I told you that by the time we caught up to the painting, we would have some shared vocabulary about painting. I can tell you that this is a fresco painting, and you know what that means. I don't need to explain it to you. I can point out to you that Raphael is using the same technique here that Leonardo used in the Last Supper. If you'll notice, there we go. You'll notice a number of different lines in the painting, all guide the eye down right to where Plato and Aristotle's shoulders come together. That's the best line I've ever drawn with a mouse. I'm awestruck. Well, notice all the different lines. Can I do it again? I'm buying a lottery ticket on the way home. Anyway, notice all the different lines here in the painting. I'm just going to push my luck. I want to quit while I'm ahead. I learned that one early in life too. But notice all the different lines, even the lines down here in the floor tiles that would all meet at that place if I was going to push my luck. They're framed in the back doorway, just like Jesus is framed in Leonardo's Last Supper. The philosophers in the painting are split up, those who sided with Plato on Plato's side of the painting, those who sided with Aristotle on Aristotle's side. Every figure here represents an Athenian philosopher except one. And I want to make sure that you understand what I mean here, because Raphael uses a number of his own friends to stand in for philosophers. For example, the face of Plato there is the face of Raphael's friend Leonardo da Vinci, the man we talked about right at the end of class last time we were together. To the left, you see that self-portrait I showed you of Leonardo da Vinci, and you recognize now Plato's face is the face of Leonardo da Vinci. Raphael uses his friend Leonardo, by now an old man, to stand in for Plato. That's quite an honor for Leonardo to be asked to play Plato's role here. But that's not what I mean when I say that one figure is representing himself. One person is placed here with the great philosophers of the Athenian tradition to honor him for what he's accomplishing almost right across the street. And that's the figure down here in the painting. This figure here. He's a late addition to the painting. He's not in the original sketches. And if you take a look at the painting, the way that the painting is put together, you see that he really doesn't fit in. Plato and Aristotle are going to walk down the steps. They're going to have to walk around Diogenes. He's the philosopher who's kind of sprawled out over here. But then they're going to have to shuffle to get down past this figure here. This is Raphael's friend Michelangelo, who's being honored for what Michelangelo has accomplished almost right across the street. And I wanted to tell you that story. At the time that Raphael is finishing this painting, Michelangelo is working on a top-secret project almost right across the street. This painting is in the Vatican Library. It's in the big reading room in the Vatican Library. The School of Athens is on one side of the reading room. On the other side of the room, you have the painting you see at the bottom of page 67, figure 11.2, Raphael's Disputa. It's a depiction of great theologians from the Christian tradition. And so there you see, right in the reading room of the Vatican Library, you have on one wall the great philosophers of Athens, on the other wall the great theologians of the Christian tradition. And there you have our two foundation cities, Athens and Jerusalem, on the wall looking down on the reading room in the Vatican Library. Anyway, while Raphael is finishing this painting, Michelangelo is working on his top-secret project, almost right across the street. Everybody knows what the project is, but nobody knows what it looks like. Michelangelo won't let anybody see it because he thinks it's going to look bad. He's afraid that when everybody sees it, they're going to laugh at it. It's not going to be any good. They'll just laugh at it. He won't let anybody see it. Well, he does have some assistants who are helping him, but he swears those assistants to secrecy. He says, if you tell anybody what this looks like, I'm going to beat you up. And Michelangelo is, he's got a bit of a temper, and he's a pretty big guy, and so those assistants, they stay pretty quiet. And the big buzz in Rome is what what Michelangelo's top-secret project looks like. Well, one night, Raphael and a friend of his, a man named Bramante, and you don't need to worry about getting his name down, but Raphael and his friend are out one night, and they're just drinking wine and watching people walk by and talking about things. And Bramante says, well, you know, Raphael, they start talking about Michelangelo's top-secret project. And Bramante turns to Raphael and says, you know, I am the Vatican architect. Now, that word architect has changed its meaning a little bit over time. At the time of the Renaissance, if you'd won someone's patronage contest to become their architect, that meant that you designed whatever buildings they wanted to have built. It also meant you did the engineering for the building. Today we think of those as two different things. You also oversaw the construction of the building. You served as the construction foreman on the project. And then you also took over the maintenance of the buildings that the patron already owned. So you made sure the housekeeping showed up on schedule. You made sure the carpets got switched out when they got worn out and all that kind of stuff. All of that to say this. Bramante says, I'm the Vatican architect, and I've got keys to every building in the Vatican. So tonight, let's sneak into where Michelangelo is working on his top-secret project, and we'll take a look at it. And Raphael says, that's a great idea, and we'll look at it, and then we'll go to Michelangelo tomorrow, and we'll say, yeah, we snuck in and saw your project. You're right, it really sucks. It's really bad. You're right. You don't want anybody to see that. We'll give them a rough time. And so Raphael and Bramante wait until the town kind of quiets down, and then they slip into this room where Michelangelo's been working. And when they light the oil lamps and the candles and can see what Michelangelo's accomplished, they're awestruck. They can't believe what they're seeing. All night long they sit there just staring at what Michelangelo has accomplished. And the next day Raphael comes back to put what were going to be the finishing touches on this painting, and instead he begins sketching in and then very quickly painting in Michelangelo, painting his friend here with the great philosophers out of Athens honoring Michelangelo for what he's accomplished pretty much right across the street. And if we turn the page just once to page 68 and 69, we can start talking about Michelangelo's top secret project here, the design and painting of the interior of the Sistine Chapel. There we go. On page 68, you have a photograph similar to this one at figure 11.3 at the top of the page. In this photograph, you're looking towards the apse end of the Sistine Chapel. I'm just going to tell you first what you're looking at, and then we'll get back to the story part. You're looking towards the apse end of the chapel. You're standing in the narthex down here. You're looking through the set of double doors that divides the narthex from the nave back in here. You'll notice that's not much of a wall there. It's mostly just a grid, but it serves to prop up these two double doors that serve that symbolic purpose that we talked about when we talked about traditional Christian architecture. At the bottom of that page, figure 11.4, you have the reverse view. Now you're standing in the apse and you're looking towards the narthex end. So if you look towards the front of the church, you see this. You turn around, look towards the back of the church, you see this. And if you look right up above your head, then you see this here, that magnificent ceiling 60 feet above your head, 6 stories up in the air above your head. You have a photograph of that ceiling on page 69 in your textbooks. So that's what it is that you're looking at when you see the Sistine Chapel. There we go. Now we're back on track. The Sistine Chapel you can think of as the Pope's local church. The Pope, at the start of the 1500s in Western Europe, there is one official church with one official Pope and one official body of teaching and so on. There are other church structures in other parts of the world. But in Western Europe, there's one official church with one official pope. But this is the local church that the Pope is the pastor of. It's the church where the Pope preaches on Sunday. You can think of it as the Pope's local church. Also, just so you know, you see there in the caption, the building is called the Sistine Chapel, not the 16th Chapel. That's a very common error and not one that you want to make. Okay? It's the Sistine Chapel, not the 16th Chapel. When this particular Pope, Julius II, comes to power in Rome, the inside of the Sistine Chapel was rather plain. The walls were just painted in off-white. The ceiling was painted a navy blue with big gold 5-point stars all over it. And the Pope thought that was kind of tacky for his church. He wanted something fancy for his church. And so he goes to Michelangelo and he says, I want you to design and paint the interior of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo says, look, you don't want me to do this job. I'm a sculptor, not a painter. Michelangelo had been brought to Rome as a client for the Pope, just like Raphael had been brought to Rome. They both serve as clients to the Pope, on like a continuing patronage contract, just to do whatever the Pope assigns them to do. But Michelangelo had made his career as a sculptor. And Michelangelo says, look, I'm a sculptor. You brought me here to sculpt for you. You don't want me to paint this. If I paint it, everybody's going to laugh at it because I'm no good at painting. Everybody's just going to laugh at it. Get somebody else to do it. Get somebody who's good at painting. Get Raphael to do it. Get somebody who's really good at painting because if you make me do it, everybody's just going to laugh at it. It won't be any good. And the Pope says, no, I want you to do it. I'm the Pope and you're not. And so Michelangelo eventually gives in and takes on this job. It's hard to play up how much Michelangelo doesn't want to do this job. At one point, he runs away from Rome and tries to live under an assumed name in another town. The Pope has to hire private investigators to track him down and bring him back in handcuffs to finish the project. I mean, he really does not want to do this work. He wants to do what he says he's good at, sculpting. But eventually he gives in and completes the project. Now, we're just talking about what we see on the screen here. Michelangelo is responsible for all the panels on this level here, the bottom level here. All the painting that you see in the photograph here is fresco painting. He's responsible for all the panels on this level except for 2. two panels that had been painted by Botticelli. We talked about Botticelli the last time we were together. Michelangelo also paints all the panels on this level here, and also that magnificent ceiling. He paints the ceiling 6 stories high in the air. He paints the ceiling lying on his back on scaffolding that he designs, lying on his back, pushing the pigment into the wet plaster. He has assistants who are hauling up fresh plaster to him and moving his scaffolding around, 60 feet up in the air. The bell tower in the center of campus is 50 feet tall. So the next time you walk past it on your way to the library or something, imagine that being scaffolding, and Michelangelo up another 10 feet higher than that, pushing the plaster into the wall. Anyway, just talking about what we're looking at in the photograph here, Michelangelo completes what we're looking at in, depending on when you start counting, between 2 and 3 years. That's moving very quickly. This is a big building. I couldn't paint it white with a roller brush in 2 years. Quite an accomplishment. But he rushes through the project so he can get back to what he wants to do, which is doing his sculpting. Looking more closely at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, in this photograph you see the most famous panel from the Sistine Chapel. It's this central panel here, which you also have in your textbook on page 70, figure 1110 on page 70. It's a panel called The Creation of Adam, this panel right here in the center. You've seen it before in TV commercials and magazine article illustrations and that kind of thing. You'll notice that there's a difference between the colors in the different photographs that you have in your textbook and in this PowerPoint presentation, and that's part of the story of the Sistine Chapel as well. The Sistine Chapel is remember that the Sistine Chapel is a church building. There are at least 2 church services a day in the Sistine Chapel. So there's almost constant incense smoke and oil lamp smoke and candle smoke. And over a 500-year period, all that smoke in the air had just laid a layer of carbon over the painting on the walls and the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Kind of like those lanterns, different people call them different things, Florida lamps, hurricane lanterns, kerosene lanterns. If you ever get around to actually using one of those things for a while, it builds up carbon on the glass globe. The same thing going on in the building, all that smoke puts carbon down there. Let's see, maybe about 50 years ago now, a process was developed where they could pull the carbon off the wall and leave the plaster and the pigment undisturbed. That was quite an effort itself. And then literally moving square centimeter by square centimeter across the walls and the ceilings, pulling off the carbon without disturbing the plaster underneath. It took quite a long time to finish the restoration process, but when that process was finished, we have instead of those dark muted colors, we have these very bright, vivid colors, the way that Michelangelo intended for us to see them. I've got some other detail from the Sistine Chapel ceiling to show you here. Here we have the prophetess Delphica. You remember that story about Socrates? Socrates' friend who goes to Delphos, he attends a temple to Apollo, and the female priest comes up and says that Socrates is the wisest man in the world. Well, that woman eventually gets the name Delphica, so there's a sideways honoring of Socrates here by placing Delphica on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. I know it sounds tacky to say, but part of the magic of the Sistine Chapel ceiling is that what you're looking at is essentially a flat surface. There's a curve to it now, but what you're looking at is essentially a flat surface. What appear to be architectural details in the columns and the statues and the little shelf there that Delphica is sitting on is all painted onto a flat surface. Michelangelo is able to capture that sense of perspective, that illusion that you're looking at a three-dimensional rounded object, so much that even in a photograph of the ceiling, we're able to pick up on that three-dimensional quality of the painting. Notice all the detail in the painting here. I'm going to make a bigger point about this in just a minute, but notice how the paper rolls into the scroll here, the individual hairs in Delphica's head, the folds of cloth in her robe. Here's another prophetess, the Cumaean Sibyl. The wrinkles in the brow, the veins in the arms, the folds of cloth in the headdress, and so on. Yet another Sibyl, the Persian Sibyl. There we go. Again, the folds of cloth in the headdress and in the robe. Here we have the prophet Daniel. Here we have the prophet Daniel. To the left-hand side, you see a photograph of Daniel before the restoration process, and to the right, you see a photograph of him afterwards, so you can compare the two images. Notice the pages in the book, the individual hairs in Daniel's head. The prophet Ezekiel from the Old Testament. Notice the wrinkles in the brow, the individual hairs in the beard, the creases in the palm of the hands. Now here's the big deal. From the floor, you can't see the creases in the palms of the hands. You can't see the fingernails on the little finger there. You can't see the individual pages of the scroll over here. Michelangelo includes details that, as far as he would know, he would be the only person who would ever see them. Michelangelo never imagined anybody building a camera with a telephoto lens and taking these photographs. Michelangelo does more work than he needs to. He does his work very quickly so that he can get done with it. He thinks when everybody looks at it, they're just going to laugh at it anyway. He really doesn't want to do the project, but he does a better job than he has to. He doesn't do a sloppy job, and that's something worth maybe taking some time to think about. He doesn't want to do the job. He thinks it's not going to be any good anyway, but he does a better job than he needs to. As far as he knows, he's the only one who would ever see the curls inside the ear of Ezekiel here. And that's part of the story of the Sistine Chapel as well. Well, when Michelangelo finishes painting the ceiling, he signs the ceiling in letters that you can see from the floor. You're supposed to see them. He wants you to see them. He signs his name, Michelangelo, and then puts a comma, and then in all capital letters, sculptor. He says, look, I'm not a painter, I'm a sculptor now. Okay, so don't laugh at it. But very few people have left the Sistine Chapel laughing at it. It's quite an accomplishment. Well, after finishing the ceiling, this Pope jumps Michelangelo over to another project. This Pope kept Michelangelo jumping from one project to another. It was a constant source of irritation for Michelangelo. But he returns almost 20 years later to finish the project by completing the apse end of the chapel, which you see on page 70 in your textbooks. We're looking here at the apse end of the Sistine Chapel. Here is the high altar up against the wall of the apse end. You may be able to see the traditionally three steps that go up to the high altar. That's why it's called high, because it's up off the ground. The Last Judgment, which fills the apse of the Sistine Chapel. Christ returns to judge the living and the dead. And on the central level, here we see people awaiting their judgment. Up above, we see some people in heaven. To the bottom, we see some people being dragged down to hell by demons and such things. Two parts of the Sistine are the Last Judgment to draw your attention to. Scenes which show up quite often in TV commercials and magazine article illustrations. This fellow here, who's completely given up now that he's realized his fate as the demons are dragging him downwards. He shows up quite often in advertisements and commercials. The last time I saw him was in an advertisement for a product that automatically backs up the hard drive on your computer, and this fellow has just realized he's lost his hard drive and all hope is over now. The other famous part of the Last Judgment is this scene here. Over here, you see a figure sitting on like a rock cloud looking thing. He's holding something in his hand here. Anybody make out what that is? Yeah, it's a human skin there. A human skin. It's a reference to St. Bartholomew, one of Jesus' disciples, later one of his apostles, who's martyred by being flayed. That's F-L-A-Y, not filleted, but flayed. Flaying someone means that that the skin is removed while someone is still alive. If you know how the human body works, you don't live very long after that. It's excruciatingly painful. There, the man is holding the skin and the knife in his other hand there. I show you the image not to gross you out, but because this is part of the story of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo, because when Michelangelo does this part of the painting, he puts his own face on the skin there. The face on the skin there is Michelangelo's own face. He puts his own face on the skin because he didn't think he got paid enough for the job. He thought he got skinned alive on the business deal. If you're not familiar with the phrase, it means he got ripped off. It's one of those few phrases that works in both Italian and in English. It means the same thing. And when we say somebody got ripped off, what are we talking about? It means skinned alive. That excruciating pain of realizing you didn't get the value of your labor or your contract or whatever. So when you go to the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo wants you to know that he's a sculptor, not a painter. And this Pope didn't pay him enough for this project. When you go to the Sistine Chapel, I want you to keep a couple of things in mind, and these rules apply elsewhere too. First of all, if you get a chance to go to Europe, this applies for the whole world, okay? But we're talking about Europe here, all right? Well, common place to visit are historic places of worship. And in Europe, there are a number of historic churches and historic synagogues which are worth visiting just to see. I mean, if you went to Europe, I would hope you would go to see a Gothic cathedral, whatever your own religious beliefs might be, just to see the architecture, okay, just to see what it's like. All right? And so when you do, just remember that these aren't museum pieces, but they're real communities, living communities, that these historic churches aren't just museums, that they're places where people in the community go to worship on Sunday, some of them, where they might take their children to be baptized, where they expect to be buried, where they go to talk to somebody if they're having problems. These are real places, okay? And so that just means that when you show up to visit them, then you show some respect. And there's a number of different ways you show respect. One way you show respect is the way that you act, but I don't have to give you people a lecture about that, okay? But another way you show respect is in the way that you dress. And Americans have a much more relaxed attitude towards dress than many people in other parts of the world. And I know I'm talking to college students in Florida. And we're talking about relaxed attitudes towards dress. I've got my target audience, okay? Because Floridians in general, and college students in general, Americans in general, just tend to be more relaxed about things than people in other parts of the world. So you don't have to dress up now, but just find out what the expectations are and show some respect when you go. I'll give you an example. I don't know of any cathedral in Europe that will let a man in if he's wearing short pants. It's just too relaxed, informal, hairy-legged. It's just a bit much. Now, for Americans, Floridians, what's a big deal? Okay, well, just understand that in other parts of the world there's different attitudes towards things. Okay? And it just helps to find out before you go. I'll tell you, if you're a man and you want people to stop in the middle of the street and laugh at you, try wearing short pants in East Africa. Because in East Africa, little boys wear short pants. A big deal in a little boy's life is when his parents buy him his first pair of long pants, and it's usually not for like Christmas or a birthday. It's just like, oh, here's your new pants. Because that means that the parents are saying he's kind of grown up. And every man in East Africa remembered his first pair of long pants because that's when the parents are saying, you're not a big guy yet, but you're kind of getting to be a big guy, so you need to have some long pants. That's like a big deal. And well, you visit and you show up and you're a man in short pants, people laugh at you in the street. Just like if you're walking downtown Ocala and saw a man in a business suit carrying a bunch of balloons and a big lollipop. It looks like that. It just doesn't belong. It's just like, what's wrong with that guy? You know, why is he dressing up like a little kid? Okay. So anyway, just find out before you go. It saves you a lot of embarrassment, and it'll affect the way you're treated. A lot of people travel overseas and then come back and say they weren't respected, and they're all upset. Well, if you dress like a little boy, you're not going to be respected. Okay. So just keep that thing up. Just practical advice for you. Okay. But anyway, when you go, just make sure that you dress properly so that you show respect to where you go. Because there'll be someone from the community there in the narthex, and if you show up and you're not dressed appropriately, they'll ask you to come back later. You see, if you keep out people who aren't dressed appropriately, you also tend to keep out people who won't behave appropriately. See how the two things kind of go together? Just some practical advice for you. Okay. Anyway, just make sure you know what the expectations are and then meet those expectations, and everything goes much smoother for you. The other thing to keep in mind, okay, and again, there's other places that this applies as well, is that the big thing about the Sistine Chapel is that is the ceiling, okay? And the number one complaint of people who've been to the Sistine Chapel is that you stand in line for quite a while to get in, and then they open up the door on one end, count a number of people in, and then close that door, and then you have 10, 15, 20 minutes, whatever, and then shove you out the other end, and keep people flowing through. And so you'll stand in line for a while, they get in, and of course you want to see the ceiling. And so you walk around looking at the ceiling, wow, that's awesome, for about 3.5 minutes. And then the neck starts to seize up, and the back starts to hurt, and the lower back starts to hurt even more, and the knees start to go, and your time's up, you come hobbling out the other end of the chapel, and it's all been a big pain in the neck, literally, because you're not used to walking around doing this. Okay. And there's other places to keep this in mind as well, but when you go, take with you a small hand mirror. Walk around, look at stuff. When you see something you want to see in person and directly, then you look up and you see it. That's pretty cool. Think how cool you'll look. Everybody else is walking around going like that, and you're just cruising around the Sistine Chapel. Think how smart you'll look. Somebody's going to say, man, you're smart. And you're going to say, yeah, I went to the College of Central Florida. Where'd you go to school? Well, at this point, if Michelangelo were here, and I was introducing him to you or something, he might be a bit upset with me right now. He might say, yeah, I did the Sistine Chapel. Talk about what I really did. Talk about my sculpture. Talk about my important stuff. And to honor Michelangelo, we do need to look at Michelangelo's sculpture. On page 71 in your textbook, figure 1112, you have Michelangelo's David. On the screen, you have the face of David here. You have the whole sculpture in your textbook. This is figure 1112. A very tall sculpture. It's almost 14 feet tall. The proportions of the body don't work, like the width of the shoulders and so on doesn't work. It was never meant to be viewed from the angles these photographs are taken from. It was originally designed to be on top of a column. I've forgotten now how tall the column was supposed to be. I want to say 50 feet tall. So it's supposed to be way up high in the air, and you look up at so the proportions of the body don't work because it was never intended to be photographed from this angle. But a very famous sculpture. It was unveiled almost exactly right when the Medici family got kicked out of power in Florence, and for quite a while Florence was a republic, and so it has a political significance in that this is associated with that time that Florence was a republic and had gotten out from underneath the rulership of the Medici family. Also on that page, figure 1115, you have Michelangelo's Pieta. We talked about a Pieta when we talked about Giotto's Pieta last week sometime. You know, you have a Pieta in painting or sculpture or poetry or music or whatever when you have the dead Jesus in the arms of his mother. And of course, that's the scene that we see here. It took me a while to get sculpture, to get what the point was with sculpture. As you're well aware by now, I'm not much of an artist myself. And the only experience I ever had with sculpture was with Play-Doh when I was a kid. You remember, excuse me. You remember Play-Doh when you were a kid? Remember the new cans of Play-Doh? Remember how hard it was to get the Play-Doh out? Did you ever think about the people who make Play-Doh at the Play-Doh factory? They got to be like the meanest people in America. All day long they stand there cramming Play-Doh down the bottom of the can so the kids can't get it out. It's just mean. I get mad just thinking about it. But you know how Play-Doh works. You take little pieces, you roll it out, and you make your little dog or whatever. That's putting pieces on, okay? With this kind of sculpture, you're taking pieces off, and you can't put them back on, Okay, once they're off, all right? It's the exact opposite. So you have to picture the process, and it took me a while to catch on, but you start off with a huge block of stone, and this marble block would have been about 9 feet cubed, because it's a large sculpture. And then you have a big heavy hammer, big heavy chisel, and you're taking pieces off of the sculpture. And so you got to picture this being, a big block, all right? And then, you're knocking pieces off with your hammer and your chisel, until you get to like right there. And you have to stop because that's going to be the big toe. And then you move around the foot. In other words, the sculptor has to picture inside the stone, has to be able to see inside the stone. Of course, I don't mean that literally, but has to be able to see inside the stone and know where the sculpture is, and then cut down to where the sculpture is and not go past it, or else it's destroyed. And that's true not only for each of the toes, but each of the folds of cloth in the robe, everything there that you see. The artist has to keep in mind where it is in the stone and keep that three-dimensional image in his mind as he's moving around the sculpture, and he has to know where that is and cut down to it and not go past it. And it might take you a while to catch on to that, but once you do, that's pretty impressive. That ability to keep that image in your mind and work down to it is a pretty impressive talent. And those who are experts in sculpture, and I'm not one of those people, almost universally call this Michelangelo's greatest individual work. And it really is a pretty impressive piece. A lot of people have had an emotional reaction to the sculpture, especially in person. There are a lot of interesting stories about Michelangelo's Pieta. This is the last sculpture that Michelangelo signs. Some of his sculptures he signed and some he didn't. Originally, the sculpture wasn't signed. It was just the sculpture. This was a patronage piece done for a wealthy man in Florence, actually. And so the sculpture is completed. It goes off to the patron, and Michelangelo moves on to his other work. But he'd always, at least for a while, had an affection for the sculpture. And whenever he had an opportunity, he would go back and visit it. He would go back and look at it. And once the patron who owns the sculpture put the sculpture on exhibit so that everybody in town could stop by and see it. And so Michelangelo traveled back to Florence to take a look at the sculpture. And he's standing there looking at the sculpture. And two men walk up to the sculpture, and they look at it for about a minute and a half. And one of the friends says to his friend, I'm not like an artsy-fartsy kind of guy, but that's really something. He says, that's, I really don't get into all this all that much, but that is really something. I mean, that's really impressive. And he says, do you know who sculpted that? And the friend says, no, I don't know. And they walked off. And Michelangelo's standing right there. And he says, wait, nobody remembers I did it. And so he goes to the patron and says, will you give me one more shot at it? I want to sign the sculpture so everybody knows what I did. And the patron says, well, sure, go ahead. And so Michelangelo takes a hammer and chisel and very quickly carves his name in all capital letters on the sculpture. It's difficult to see, and in retrospect, I should have gone online and tried to find a clearer image. But you see where Mary has a purse strap that's hanging over her shoulder and goes between her breasts there, right across her chest. There's that leather strap of the purse right across Mary's chest. I think I'm doing the wrong shoulder. Right across her chest. And Michelangelo takes that flat leather piece of the sculpture and in big capital letters right across the sculpture carves Michelangelo right across the sculpture there. In writing about that experience, Michelangelo says that he finishes his name and he steps back and looked at it, and he said immediately, he says, the sculpture died for him. That part of his affection for the sculpture was as a believing Christian, thinking about a Christian understanding of what's going on in the sculpture. And now when he looks at it, all he can see is his own pride right across there. Look what I did. Look how great I am. And he says that immediately he lost all of his affection for the sculpture. All he could picture was his own pride. That's one of those stories about the Pieta. It indicates some of the emotional response some people have had to the painting, and also tells you a little bit, I think, about Michelangelo. There you see that pride and also that kind of humility there at the end of the story. A very complex person, a very complicated personality. There are all kinds of strange stories about the Pieta. It has triggered violent reactions from schizophrenics. It's been attacked a few times. All kinds of strange stuff. If you want to find strange stories, just look up stuff about Michelangelo's Pieta. One thing that's strange about the sculpture that hardly anybody notices at first, my guess is probably 3/4 of you haven't noticed it yet, but you can't help but notice it once it's pointed out to you, is the radical difference in body size between Jesus and Mary there. Mary's what? Maybe 4 or 5 times as big as Jesus? Just in terms of body mass? That's right. Jesus portrayed so much smaller there to plant a subconscious image in your mind, and that is, mother holding a child. Got it immediately. Because although Jesus is an adult, of course he's still her child. And that image of a mother holding a little child, I think that adds to that emotional response. People don't notice it, but subconsciously they see that smaller body, they're reminded of a mother holding a child, and it adds to that reaction. Well, very interesting sculpture, and if you're interested, there's all kinds of things to learn about Michelangelo's Pieta. On page 72 in your textbooks, figures 11-16, on page 72. Another sculpture by Michelangelo. This is Michelangelo's Moses. Moses, the great lawgiver that we talked about when we talked about the Hebrew legacy a few weeks ago. Over here you see the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments. Moses being honored there for being the great lawgiver. Get rid of that ink there. There we go. This was a sculpture that was completed for the tomb of this pope. The Pope had envisioned a massive tomb for himself. I should have gotten you a photograph of the sketch of the tomb. It's a massive mausoleum just for himself. That tomb was never built. When this Pope died, they just took whatever rocks they had and piled it on top of the guy and said, goodbye. Nobody liked this Pope. But this was one sculpture that was completed for a much, much more modest tomb than this Pope envisioned for himself. Michelangelo's Moses. This very attractive brown marble here. You may have noticed by now that Moses has horns coming out of his head. That might strike you as unusual, have horns coming out of Moses' head. But in fact, it's not unusual at all. In fact, it is usual for several hundred years to see depictions of Moses with horns coming out of his head. On the screen here, not in your textbook, but just so that you can see it, to the left I've got a baptismal font from the 13th century. And you see there the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments again down here. And of course you see the horns on Moses' head up here. From some illuminated manuscripts, over here is a sculpture, of course. You see the horns on Moses' head here, the 10 Commandments. Here's an illuminated manuscript. Moses, the horns there, and then Moses' horns here, and of course the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments. Wait a second. There we go. So in fact, it is normal to have the horns there for quite some time. Why does Moses have horns on his head? Well, that takes a little bit of explanation. At the start of the 1500s in Western Europe, there is one official church with one official pope, one official body of teaching, and one official Bible. But the official Bible of the official church was not the Greek and Hebrew texts of Christian scripture, but instead a translation of those texts, a translation into Latin. A translation of the Greek and Hebrew texts of Christian scripture into Latin, that translation called the Vulgate. The Vulgate was translated by a man named Jerome, translated by St. Jerome about the year 300, about 1,200 years before Michelangelo's time. By the year 300, unless you were Jewish, you didn't read Hebrew. And so very, very few people could read the Christian Old Testament. And as Christianity spreads further west in the Roman Empire, fewer and fewer people spoke or read Greek as a second language. And so Jerome translates the Old and New Testaments into Latin so that more people would be able to read it. And this becomes the official Bible of the official church. Jerome was a brilliant scholar, very intelligent, very well-educated man, and a very good translator. But he was also a human being, and that means that he did make some mistakes, some errors in translation. None of these translations, big errors, I wouldn't call them. They don't affect any of the teachings of the church or anything like that, okay? But yeah, definitely errors. And the most famous of these errors in translation that Jerome makes is in translating a story about Moses, a story that comes out of the Exodus. Moses goes on top of a mountain to meet with God. And while he's meeting with God, it's like he absorbs like spiritual radiation or something. He gets like a glow-in-the-dark face, and beams of light come off of Moses' head. Well, Moses comes down off the mountain. People see him walking around with beams of light coming off his head, and they're afraid of him. You would be too. And so Moses takes a cloth and puts them over his head so that people won't be afraid of him. Well, in translating that story, Jerome is translating the story. The Hebrew word for beam of light is very close to the Hebrew word for horn. The two words are very close to each other. And in translating the story, Jerome just makes a simple mistake. Instead of reading beams of light coming off of Moses' head, Jerome reads that horns grew out of Moses' head. And when he comes down off the mountains walking around, people see him walking around with horns coming out of his head. They're afraid of him. You would be too. And so he takes a cloth and puts them over his head so that people won't be afraid of him. So there's an error in translation there. A big error, well, this isn't exactly one of the major teachings of the church, you know. I'm not even sure whether it really matters for the story, honestly. The point of the story is that in this divine encounter, Moses has changed in some way that is obvious to other people and makes other people uncomfortable. I'm not sure really all matters all that much, even for the story. But it is a mistake. Okay, it is a mistake. All right. And so that explains why Moses is often depicted with the horns coming out of his head. There's a good reason, a mistaken reason, but a good reason. And that is that for several hundred years, the official Bible of the official church has a translation error in it. I'll tell you the story for a couple of reasons. For one thing, you will see depictions of Moses with horns coming out of his head, and now you'll know why. So if you happen to be visiting a church in Europe and you see a statue of a guy with horns coming out of his head, don't hunt down the pastor and say, why do you have a statue of Satan in your church? It's probably not Satan. He was carrying around a copy of the Ten Commandments, probably a good clue. Probably Moses, not Satan. And also because, more seriously, by the 1500s, the church has a bunch of problems. That's been a minor theme of several of the last online presentations. I mentioned the political and financial corruption when we talked about Dante's Divine Comedy. When I talked about Francis, I told you that many people in Western Europe identify themselves proudly as Christians and have no idea what the religion teaches because everything's in Latin. Now you know even the official Bible's in Latin. Hardly anybody in Europe can read the official Bible, even if they have a copy, can't read it. And not only that, but everybody who cares to knows that the official Bible of the official church has translation errors. Major errors, we can argue about that. But if you're serious about stuff, you want to know what the text says. Well, what does it say? Okay, and everybody who cares knows that the official Bible of the official church has faulty translations in it. Well, as we're going to see pretty soon, the whole thing's going to fall apart. All these problems are going to pile up on the church, and the church is going to be completely destroyed and disintegrated. We're not quite there yet, but we'll get to it pretty quickly. Also, in your textbook, you have an example from a series of sculptures by Michelangelo called the Captive series. You have the Boboli Captive on page 71 in your textbook, figure 1113, and on the screen. The Captive series, they're called, is not really a series of sculptures, but a collection of unfinished sculptures. Michelangelo, this Pope kept jumping Michelangelo from one project to the next, and by the time Michelangelo died, he had a whole bunch of projects still unfinished. And someone had the foresight to collect these unfinished sculptures in one place so that we can see how Michelangelo does his work, cutting down through the stone to where the sculpture is. They're called the Captive series. I've got some others here to show you. Someone with a good imagination named them because it looks almost like people are being held captive inside the stone, and Michelangelo is liberating them, bringing them out of the stone. And another view of this captive here. At one point, Michelangelo was asked, how do you do it? How do you take a rock and turn it into a human being? And Michelangelo said, it's actually very easy. You just take away all the parts that don't look like a human being. Well, that's kind of a smart alecky answer, okay? But that's kind of what he's doing. He takes away all the parts that don't look like a human being, while he's left for all the parts that do look like a human being. And here we can add one more characteristic to Michelangelo's work. And some of you have already picked up on it, and that is the emphasis on heavy muscular development. The heavy musculature that we start to see forming in the captive here. We definitely see that heavy muscular development with Moses. Moses has been to the gym. He's been doing that full circuit body training stuff too. We don't get the heavy muscular development with Jesus' body here, but again, that's because Michelangelo is portraying Jesus as childish, okay? So we have the smaller body and not the muscular development. But check out Mary there. Look at the large bicep on Mary's arm, the massive calf on Mary's leg there, that heavy muscular development underneath the robe there. Jesus has been to the gym, been doing a bunch of ab crunches, it looks like. Man, you can't overdo that stuff, you know. Everybody's been to the gym. The prophet Ezekiel's been to the gym. Look at that guy's neck. That's like a 28-inch neck. That guy's huge. Delphica's been doing some barbell work there. Look at that baby angel's back. Adam's been in the gym. He just got created like 3 seconds ago. And when we come back to Raphael's School of Athens, Michelangelo's been in the gym. He's a big guy. Michelangelo takes up weightlifting, bodybuilding, really for 2 reasons. For one thing, to burn off the stress of dealing with this miserable pope. And the other because that if you're going to be a sculptor like Michelangelo, and you're going to make your living by breaking rocks apart, and you're going to be swinging a big heavy hammer on a big heavy chisel all day, you got to have some body mass behind you to drive that chisel through the stone. And the way you get that mass is by tearing down the muscle and rebuilding it. You got to have that. You got to have some size behind you to power your way through that rock. And then before we leave Raphael's School of Athens, I want just to point out to you something about the painting here that I think is kind of cool. And that is the way that Michelangelo depicts Raphael here. The opposite. The way that Raphael depicts Michelangelo. Remember the story, Raphael is honoring Michelangelo for painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, or the Sistine Chapel in general. But he also knows something about his friend Michelangelo, that Michelangelo wants to be remembered as a sculptor. And Raphael portrays Michelangelo here leaning on a block of marble, working on a sketch for a sculpture. He has the thick leather cloak that sculptors wear to keep the stone chips from cutting into the clothing or into the body as the stone chips are coming off the sculpture. And I just think that's kind of cool. It says something about friendship here, that Raphael knows how Michelangelo wants to be remembered. And so as long as this painting is around, we'll remember that Michelangelo was a great sculptor. And that's just kind of cool. Raphael knows something about his friend Michelangelo here. Going to move now, if I can get my cursor to stay put, to a discussion of the first real movement we're going to be talking about in the course. Let me get set up here. There we go, mannerism. The first movement or school we're going to be talking about, the first ism of many isms, mannerism. When I say a movement, what I mean is a group of people who are doing pretty much the same thing at pretty much the same time. When I say a school, I don't mean a school like a place where you go and you pay tuition, you get homework assignments and that kind of thing, but I mean like a school of fish. You've seen a school of fish in a pond where they're all doing the same thing at the same time. That's what I mean by a school of mannerism or the movement of mannerism. Mannerism is a particular movement in the 1500s in Western culture. We see it in literature, music, all kinds of things. But we're going to start off by looking at mannerism in painting. The chief characteristic of mannerism is a concept we call absurdity. Absurdity, using that word a little bit differently than we do in conversation. Here, absurdity means things that are strange, unusual, weird, odd, things that don't make an awful lot of sense, being done on purpose. And that's how the word's kind of different than the way we usually use it. Weird, strange, odd things, unusual things, things that don't make an awful lot of sense being done on purpose. And I think it helps to start off looking at some painting. On page 73 in your textbook, you have some examples of mannerism. Here we have Parmigianino's Madonna of the Long Neck. This is figure 1120 on page 73. One characteristic of mannerism in painting is what we call the overextended figure. That's a fancy way of saying bodies that are too long, or parts of bodies that are too long. The Madonna of the Long Neck is so called because the Madonna has a long neck. What else is long in the painting here? The baby. That's like a 9-year-old baby. The torso area, that's the area from the shoulders to the hip of Mary here, the torso of the baby. The long fingers of Mary, the long feet and toes of Mary, the long thigh of the figure over here, the long body of the prophet guy back here, the long arm here as he's reading that scroll. Speaking of which, is that prophet guy a little bit strange back there? Nobody quite figures out what he's doing back there. He's standing next to a series of columns. Something unusual about the column: it's not holding anything. It's not doing anything. It's just sitting there. It's not holding anything up. Next to that painting, we have Pontormo's deposition scene. This is figure 1121 on page 73. This is a deposition scene and not a pieta scene, because you have the body of Jesus, but he's not in the arms of his mother, but instead being deposited. That's why it's called a deposition, deposited into the tomb. Another characteristic of mannerism in painting is the odd colors, an odd color scheme. By odd colors here, I don't mean bad colors, but I mean these fluorescent, neon, electric colors, the pinks and reds and blues and greens, the very bright, very vivid colors. Not necessarily bad colors, just these very bright electric, neon, fluorescent colors. We also have another characteristic of mannerism in painting, and that is clothes that are too tight. Like the figure's hot pink spandex shirt down the bottom of the stack there. Or the figure in the green leotard up at the top of the stack there. Clothes that are just a little bit too tight. We see mannerism in other areas of culture as well. You can see it in architecture on that page with, guess who? Michelangelo again. You thought we were finished with Michelangelo, but no, here he is again as an architect. That is that idea of the Renaissance man, you see. He's good at painting, good at sculpting, good at architecture. Here we have the bottom of page 73, the entranceway to the Laurentian Library, the big library in Florence. It's an odd little room. This is the best photograph. No, I'm sorry. This is a photograph from the ceiling, from above the staircase. Excuse me. This is the best photograph I could find to show you how the staircase looks. The first time that you walk into the room. The first time you walk into the room and look directly up the staircase, it looks like you can't get to the central panel, the central flight of stairs from the outside flight. Let's go back a second. From the floor, when you first walk in, it looks like you can't get over. You can walk up these stairs, but you can't get over to the main flight. There we go. It looks like the banister goes straight up the side and there's no way over. As you move around the room, you see there is a way to get up and over. But the stairs, at least at first glance, don't seem to go anywhere. Does the room have windows? Well, it has window frames, but no windows. It has columns, but those columns start halfway up the wall. Columns that start halfway up the wall don't do anything. They don't hold anything up. They don't support anything. There we go. I thought I had another photograph there. You see where the columns start halfway up the wall. Stairs that look like they don't go anywhere. Windows that aren't windows. Columns that aren't columns. It's an odd little room. It's a good example of mannerism and architecture. All kinds of little things that just don't make an awful lot of sense. Now here's the general theory. The general theory is that when we see absurdity in a culture, when we see things being done that are unusual and strange and odd and weird and being done on purpose, then we see a society, we see a culture that's in crisis. We see a culture that is pessimistic about the future. We see a culture that has lost any kind of self-esteem, a culture which has lost any kind of hope for the future, that feels important parts of itself dying off, that sees itself in decline, a culture that's in crisis. We're going to see if that doesn't help us make sense out of looking at things in the rest of the semester, because we're going to be looking at absurdity off and on. It's going to pop up again and again, off and on in the rest of the semester. Well, for the 1500s in Western Europe, there's certainly a cultural crisis, and that's the complete destruction of the church. The church completely implodes. The whole thing blows up and disintegrates. The church survives the fall of Rome. It survives the barbarian invasions. It survives the Dark Ages. It survives bubonic plague. But it's not going to survive the Renaissance. At the start of the 1500s in Western Europe, there is one official church with one official pope and one official Bible, one official body of teaching, and so on. At the end of the 1500s, there are dozens of church structures across Western Europe, each with their own organizational structure, each with its own body of teachings, and so on. Now, Christianity isn't destroyed. That'd be an odd thing to say.